Your recorded voice is your voice.
Well, that is a problem also. So are we there?
Yeah, this is what you sound like to everybody.
Just like this.
In your head, you're listening to your sinuses and stuff.
I'm part baleen whale.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Pre-Accident Podcast. I'm your host, Todd Conklin. How art thou today? Yeah, good. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, that's good. Yep, me too. Good. No complaints. Today is a big podcast for you guys because you always are asking about this topic. Today we're going to talk about metrics. Metrics. It is a big deal, metrics. I think it's a big deal because we have this kind of ever-present, unyielding belief that if we cannot measure it, it must not be true. Even though we know that's not true. We totally know that's not true. But that underlies everything. And if that's not enough, and I would think it would be, but it's not enough, we get people on us 24/7 asking us for metrics. And what they really want are these predictive metrics. Let's come up with a leading metric that will tell us the future. If we could come up with that, baby, the world would be such a wonderful place to hang out. That's all I'll tell you. How are you doing? Because for me, geez, it's the year's zooming by again. What is happening to us? I mean, we're getting older, and I shouldn't talk about it. Let's not talk about that. Erase that last thing. We're experiencing more and more life every single day. And as we journey around the sun, which is what we do, you know, do we get wiser and older or just older? I don't know. I think wiser. I'm going with wiser because I definitely feel wiser now than I used to. I think the best thing about getting older, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong or not, is I sort of have less craps to give when people bug me. So there. So as far as the New Year's resolution, however, trying to find goodness in everything, that's a pretty good resolution. I might keep that one a while. That one's fun. And seems pretty helpful. Things are going marvelous. Geez, I can't complain about anything. So I'd like to, but I don't really have much to complain about, except to tell you, this isn't a complaint though, that we ought to probably start with the podcast. So today I'm going to introduce you to a long friend of mine. In fact, we worked together at Los Alamos, and he's an expert in assessments and metrics. He's also a phenomenally interesting, almost a Renaissance guy. I mean, he does everything, this guy. His name's Ned Harris. And Ned and I got together and we're chatting. And I asked him if he would be a part of the podcast. And so he went home and listened to some and didn't turn it down, which is a plus, I would say. And, well, you'll see what we talk about because with Ned on the other side of the microphone, there are so many things you can kind of pick his brain about. But the one I wanted to talk to him most of all was about this notion of metrics, of assessment. And that's what he knows a ton about. He's an expert in assessment. So listen carefully and tell me, tell me if you don't learn. I'll be shocked if you don't learn anything at this podcast. That's how good this podcast is. So without further ado, I'll shut up other than to thank you for listening. Tell your friends, become a part of the giant podcast community. There's like 12 million downloads. It's crazy. Know that I love you and that I hope you love me, but I love what we do together. I like this community we built. So here's Ned Harris and metrics and reliability. So tell me who you are and what's interesting about you, Ned.
Well, my name is Ned Harris. I am a friend of Todd Conklin's, and that is cool. I've had the privilege of working with Todd, which also meant I had the privilege of commuting with Todd, and that was fascinating because we would have astonishing conversations. And the part, every day. It was not, we never listened to the radio. The part that's really stuck with me the most is when I see a car that's driving completely recklessly or just too fast. I think to myself, that guy's on his way to the hospital because that is what Todd used to
That's
say.
what I would always say.
That's
Whenever
what you say.
a car would zoom by us, I'd say, he's taking his child to the hospital.
Oh, no, it wasn't even, no. You just say he's on his way to the hospital. And it was interesting because Santa Fe has a regional trauma center and Los Alamos has a regional trauma center. And so you and I were always driving between two regional trauma centers.
That's true.
At some point, I realized what you meant was the way that guy's driving, he's going to end up in the hospital. And anyway.
So I think my intention was that he was driving like his kid was going to the hospital.
Oh. What I got was that is how you end up in the
How
hospital.
interesting that years later we would clear that up.
Yeah, well, we had to clear the air sometime. So I'm a retiree from the lab, and the lab I was sort of a hack statistician, did a lot of metrics, which really became my focus. My undergrad is in economics, my graduate degree is in assessment, and so that was a natural for metrics, and it was great because in order to generate them at some point, I had to understand them, which meant I had to visit work groups and I had to understand what made them successful. I had to understand what they needed in terms of trending information to be better at what they do. And so I got exposed really broadly across the laboratory and enjoyed that a great deal.
Why are metrics so important to us?
Well, there's a cynical answer and there's a more straightforward answer. Let's do the straightforward answer. There's a belief that you can't manage what you can't measure, right?
Which I would suggest sounds legit. That sounds true.
Yeah.
But I think that's not true.
Yeah, I agree. Because what we measure, of course, is what's easiest to measure. A lot of the times, and the things that are most important to measure are often immeasurable. I mean, if you pull the camera back a little bit and you think about our life satisfaction or something that truly is important, it's not measurable. Your bank can't tell you your you can't go get a report on it from the Social Security Administration. You can't ask someone to rate love on a scale of 1 to gazillion. And so when you really move into areas that are very, very important, unless you've got, unless it's temperature or something, unless it's distance or something, unless it's some sort of really concrete, discrete item, measurement's a problem. Certainly quantitative measurement is a problem.
How do you measure things that don't happen? So one of the challenges, and metrics are just a gigantic topic everywhere. One of the challenges that people have is if you want a stable and reliable system, that means nothing is happening. Nothing bad is happening, right? So you can't measure bad things because bad things don't happen. Or when they do happen, they're pretty rare. Fair enough. I mean,
absolutely.
What do you do with this?
So, the seismograph, we could sit here with the seismograph of the San Andreas Fault or something, and it's rife with data, and it's got all kinds of variance. It's got all kinds of noise in it. It looks like it would be really rich, and it's really accurate, and it's triangulated, and it's an amazing data source, and it describes things perfectly, but they only make sense once they've already happened, right? And so back to your initial question of measuring things that don't happen. Well, you can measure things that do happen, and you can measure things that happen well. And you have to be careful that you're not just using your profit and loss sheet, or you have to be careful that you're not thinking in terms of, optimization.
Can I interrupt you? Because you're making me think of a question. So you can measure things that go well, but mostly things go well. So isn't it really hard to measure the things that go right because there's so damn much of them?
No. I mean, you're asking a different question, perhaps, which is why bother? Because they're super easy to measure. And for a lot of stuff, it's really, really important. And I may contrast with some of your thoughts, but I think uptime is really valuable. I think that successful, interactions are really valuable. I think, positive customer experience is really valuable. But that's business as normal. And so measuring business as normal, I think, is probably easy and worthwhile and can produce useful information. Metrics also move into a place where they become very ritualized and they become very symbolic.
Okay, talk about that. That is super interesting to me.
So ritual, ritual is great, actually. Ritual culture lives in ritual. We can think about, the actual definition of the word meme, which is not a kitten.
What is the definition of the word meme?
Well, a meme. So I go back. I'm sure it goes back further, but I go back to about Richard Dawkins, and Richard Dawkins had this notion that a meme was sort of a cultural gene, and that it was a way in which culture and interactions and interrelations and institutions perpetuated themselves, how they prospered. And he went all in, and he really took the gene metaphor for a meme, took the gene metaphor to a place where he applied evolution to it. And so you would have mutations, and you would have competition, and you would have inheritance. And so he saw, our culture today clearly is very different than our culture was for, say, our grandparents. And, you could look at something like the language that has grown up around texting, or the language which has grown up around the internet, which is not, it wasn't, no one told us to say LOL. This is something that evolved, it mutated, it survived, and it has, now there's rolling on the floor laughing, and I don't know all those things, but
LMOA, no, LMAO, I think that one's dirty.
I thought you said we should keep this clean.
Yeah.
So anyway, so you look at, so that's a very simple example of a cultural evolution where we've moved to a acronym based language that, has mutated, and it has survived, and it has, reproduced in essence. And so this whole notion of ritual, particularly within organizations, I think is worth resting on for a moment, because ritual is how organizations have culture, how it gets transmitted, how new people get assimilated, how old people get fired, how, I could have said that better.
No, that was nice.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I, within organizations, that notion of ritual is fine. The problem with ritual, though, is that we don't always have mutation and competition, and so you can end up getting stuck, or you can end up having a false culture where you present one sort of ideal of what your organization is like, while in reality your organization is very, very different. And so I think we can talk a little bit about why it's really, really important to change your metrics all the time.
Well, so basically. Talk about that, because one of the things, Ned, I talk to people about is that in a complex system, and I don't know how familiar you are with complexity theorist kind of stuff, but there's a guy in Dalhousie University in Canada, kind of the Harvard of Canada, just in case you're one, who tells me all the time, you can't measure a complex system with a fixed metrics, because complexity is about the interface. It's about the coupling, right?
Yeah.
And so he uses this idea of vectoring metrics. What do you think about that?
It sounds like something unique to Canada to me. No, I can't speak to vectoring metrics at all. But I can speak to Russian metrics, and so there's this notion of like the ideal, going back to Trotsky or something. This ideal of you have this permanent revolution,
right?
I think is worth thinking about a little bit, because I agree with this notion of complexity, and that a static measure is not going to capture anything useful about a complex environment.
Right.
And I always have liked the notion of sort of triangulation, where you measure different things at different times and see where they overlap. And that's all. That's almost so abstract that it's not useful.
Well, could you triangulate? Could you take an organization and create could you play with micro experiment with those ideas?
So I'm reminded of one thing which I thought was great is when I was working at the laboratory in Los Alamos, one of the things that I stepped into was a years and years and year trend of internal organizational questionnaires and surveys.
Right.
And it was fascinating reading them because I learned so much about the organization. There was a period where everything had to do with teaming or total quality or diversity or cross-training and job sharing.
Right.
And reading the questionnaire was the most direct way for anyone to learn about what the focus of the management was at that time. And of course it moved, safety remained fairly strong in there. Management quality remained pretty strong in there. But all of the other questions that were a little more dynamic really showed what was culturally important to the laboratory at any given moment. And that, I could not have gotten onboarded more quickly than just by reading the questionnaires from prior years. And so that's perhaps an example of what you're discussing. Perhaps it's a little too simplistic.
No, I think that's super interesting. You could look at those old employee surveys, I think we call them. If you look at them backwards, they really are artifacts of what the organization, of what the flavor of the month was for the entire organization, right?
Yeah. And, and it's if you actually believe that organizations evolve and change, then it might not actually even be the flavor of the month.
Nice.
These might have been the things that were in, the mutations that were then in competition that then were able to propagate.
Yeah, touche. Nice. That's nice. That's nice. So what do we do with this metrics problem? Can we triangulate? Are metrics predictive for non-predictive events?
No.
Okay, yeah, so
that's called tautology.
Fair enough. Okay, got me there. Okay, so tell me more.
So metrics are they're we're speaking so abstractly about something which is so large that it's a little hard to pin anything really useful on this.
So can I let me define it down a little?
Thank you.
Because that might help us. So almost everywhere I go, the organization is desperately seeking what they call leading metrics. That's as fine of a point as I can put on it.
Yeah. Baby. I would say that there are places where you can have a leading metric. I've done metrics looking at information technology, detection of events, detection of we'll leave it at events. And so there are places where you set your tools in such a way that you start getting lots and lots of false positives. And you take a lot of organizational energy and you go off and you chase down these false positives and you start realizing, that was, that port scan was harmless, or that was actually someone who was, doing a backup routine to an external server, or this wasn't exfiltration. And so then you change your tools, you change your sensitivity a little bit, and to a point where you start recognizing that, at this point, we're about to start getting a lot of false negatives. And so we're getting hacked, we're getting infiltrated, we're getting whatever, data is exfiltrating, and we're no longer sensitive to it. And so there is a way to, or at least, hypothetically, academically, there's a way to look at your tools and start saying, well, what level of false negative is acceptable? Do we have, sort of a defense in depth such that someone does a port scan and they successfully find an open port, but we're able to stop it somewhere down the track? At what level do we not? Can we miss that port scan and still be okay?
Resilience.
Resilience. And so I would, and I did a presentation on this, which I've of course quickly forgotten. But there's, just by using sort of control chart methodology, you can start saying, okay, our tolerances are such that we can accept some false negatives. We're willing to run down some false positives, but we want to strike that balance. And I think if you're able to strike that balance, and if you're able to go back and say, go back to your logs and see which of these events actually were important that you missed, then I think you can end up with a metric that may be forward-looking. I think you may be able to start, being able to generalize. And that doesn't stop you, that doesn't stop the 100-year flood. It doesn't stop the 0 day that you had no knowledge about. But I think that I think you can at least start to get a sense of how your tools are tuned, and if your tools are tuned, then you should be able to infer some predictive quality.
So take me back to the San Andreas Fault. Are there leading metrics to identify earthquakes?
Well, there are no elephants right now anywhere near the San Andreas Fault. They're wild ones. And they're known, in Indonesia, they see that they actually are pretty good. They have a foreshadowing of earthquakes.
Yes, it's true.
So,
and, what's that fish that they just found in Japan coming up from the bottom that the fishermen found that they see as an earthquake indicator? We can talk about this later.
Yeah, we should.
I can tell by your face that you're not as attuned to the Japanese fisherman fish story as I am.
No, but I'm probably prepared to talk about it because I do have butter, white wine, and capers,
which really are the three essential ingredients.
Lemon juice.
That we struggle so desperately to solve for uncertainty, and we struggle so desperately with metrics to do that. Is it a fool's errand? Are there benefits?
Mathematically, probably not so much. Culturally, I think there are. I think that asking people to measure, asking people, how do they know if they've been successful? How do they want to be judged? When they go home at the end of the day and they feel like they've done a great job, there's some of those things that we can measure. And so I think that is probably worthwhile. In terms of safety metrics, it's crazy because you're back to measuring things that don't happen or being able to predict the future. And being able to predict the future, I mean, it's a neat trick, but it's not a numeric trick.
It seems like kind of more of a movie trick, like a good science fiction movie. The team can almost always predict the future, but I don't know if it exists in real life.
Well, those are just the movies that succeed. There are a lot of movies that fail.
Fair enough. Well, talk to me about the problem with small numbers.
Well, the problem with small numbers is, and we want them to be small numbers because there are things like serious injuries.
Define it for us a little. When we talk about problem with small numbers, that's a term of art. What do we mean by that?
Well, I'm not sure I can quite do a definition on the fly, but I can give you a couple of examples.
So I'll give you my secret weapon. If you're ever writing a definition on the fly, just say this phrase: the degree to which, and then that makes it official.
Well, the degree to which we can analyze numbers.
Perfect.
Yeah. And so if you have, imagine a very large data set, very robust, lots of variance, lots of noise in it. And you can start talking about a population. You can start talking about things that are within that population and things that are outside of that population. And you have, a lot of information to work with. And so so back to the seismic data, you've got this incredible amount of seismic data, and you can start saying how deep things are and how frequently they happen. And you can start talking with confidence about at least descriptive statistics. And that's a distinction maybe we should rest on for a second, because that's almost all metrics are descriptive statistics. And it's, counts and frequencies and how far things, what the spread of the data looks like. And all of that is just going back and sort of analyzing things that have probably already happened, really. Whereas an inferential statistic would be the people's likelihood of doing well in the future if they go to college, for instance. And so we can start looking at a current piece of data and start predicting a future outcome by inferring it. And there's wonderful statistical tests. We always want to do that. We go to the grocery store and the parking lot's full and we think, oh my goodness, the store is going to take forever. We're inferring all this stuff. Sometimes we're right. Sometimes we're not. And so statistics is great because statistics will say, oh, there's also a movie theater that shares this parking lot, or there's all, and so suddenly at this point you can start saying, oh, I can't infer anything about the inside of the store from the outside of the store. But back to small numbers. So imagine if you had the opportunity to, double your money and you had $1.
I'm with you so far.
Okay.
You've got my interest.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can cash this check, Todd. But if we doubled your money, you'd have $2. And so you end up with these, and that's let's even pick something a little bit simpler. Let's say an increase of 10% for you and me, or an increase of 10% for Bill Gates. And suddenly you end up with this notion of like, oh, you take a small number and you multiply it by a factor and you end up with a small number. Whereas you take a large number and you multiply it by a similar factor, you can end up with these really rather large numbers.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you're observing one worker who's doing one task and you're getting single data points, you've spent a pleasant day, I'm sure, but you probably don't have anything you can generalize from.
Right.
Whereas if you're watching a lot of people and you have a lot of this sort of information and you're watching them do a variety of tasks, and the tasks all, some of them you involve the same skills, some of them involve other skills, but you've got this robust data set, you can start using terms like outliers, and you can start saying, okay, either this, which I would say the outliers typically are the most interesting thing, although a lot of people would say, oh, that data does not belong with all this other data. We're going to put it aside and do our analysis on things that we consider to be typical. And so, but I think really all the interesting stuff is in the outliers. The typical stuff is kind of boring and not necessarily useful or not necessarily beneficial. Whereas all the stuff that seems anomalous and seems peculiar, whether really good or really bad or really lots and lots or very little, whatever the extremes of the scale are, that typically is where interesting things happen. That's where discoveries are made, and that's where accidents happen, and that's where the incredible game-winning score happens, or the ball that bounces off the field post. And so it's really that if I were looking for interesting things in data, I would probably be more interested in the outliers initially.
That's so strange to me, though, because we tell our organizations on the quality side, when we collect quality data, to actually ignore the outliers.
Yeah.
But in fact, I agree with you. I think the outliers, like a fatality accident, is an outlier, because normally people don't die.
That's kind of the definition of accident, right?
Yeah, right,
Okay.
right. And I wonder how we craft the value to understand these outliers as really kind of weak signals to potential high learning.
There's a funny handoff, and I don't want to sound like a Philistine, but there's a really funny handoff between quantitative data and qualitative data.
Tell me more. Now I'm listening.
And so quantitative data is what, we want our metrics to be. Basically, you want your profit and loss statement, which is a great metric, your statement of owner's equity, that's a great metric. You want those things to be, quantitative. You want those to have number and math and reproducibility, and you want all that real rigor behind them. But if you get to a situation where suddenly you've got a lot more waste than you used to have, or a lot more defective material, or a lot whatever it happens to be, at some point you have to make that jump and say, knowing how much this is costing or knowing how much we're spending is not giving us any information, and that you need to jump over and start looking at the whys and the what actually happened,
the context, right?
The context. There you go. That's the word, context. And so that becomes very, very important. And if you've ever, like for instance, if you've ever opened a bank statement, and this happens to me all the time, I say that, well, that can't be right. And so I've got this sort of notion of sort of face validity.
You're cracking me up here. Hardly ever do statisticians crack me up.
Well, I'm not. I'm not a statistician.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Metrics experts crack me up.
I'm an unlicensed therapist. So at some point, you've got this sort of notion of face validity. There are things that you can expect. There are things you can anticipate. There are things that seem right. And so you sort of have this sense of, oh yeah, I would have expected that outcome, or I would have expected this outcome. And so occasionally you say, whoa, that doesn't seem right. And that's a fascinating moment, because you've dumped the quantitative data, basically. The bank statement clearly is wrong. And you've jumped over to the sort of qualitative, an impression, what I don't even know quite all the things to put around it. But you've got estimation, you've got approximation, you've got sort of intuition, and we would like to think it's predictive sometimes. And so that is probably a really positive outcome from quantitative metrics, is to have this sense that, well, I'm not so sure about that. And it's a skill that I instill, I do my best to instill that into people. I'm a GED tutor. I'm a literacy volunteer. And so I do my best to try to get people when they're doing math to say, that doesn't seem right, and sort of then circle back and see what happened. And that's great when you're doing math, when you're doing division. But when you move out into the world and you've got live data and you've got live people and you've got, organizations and you've got, new software platforms and you've got whatever, that sort of that qualitative leap of saying, boy, I'm not sure that's right, that doesn't seem right, is interesting. You can find mistakes that are in algorithms, perhaps, or you can find bad data. You can find that you're really collecting the wrong data or misrepresenting what the data might be able to tell you. But the other piece of it is that, from my experiences, you interject a bunch of bias. And I had very strong feelings about, it was an organization I was very familiar with, how they should function, how managers should function, where problems reside, where problems manifest. And so when I was some measurements I would come up with and I would think, that doesn't seem right. And there were times when I was just sort of being my power to the people sort of hippie self and actually the measurements were measuring what I thought they were measuring, but my social, structural, cultural framework suggested that things should be different and more idealized. And so when you make the jump between qualitative, or rather quantitative and qualitative data, it starts becoming kind of subjective. And if you're good at what you do, subjectivity that rocks. That's excellent. And if you're not very good at what you do, subjectivity is really disastrous.
Is that where things make sense prima facie? So they make sense on their face, face validity or whatever?
Yeah.
So that's got value.
Oh, yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. It's got value, but you have to be careful. If your whole goal is to have a really high performing workforce, and your only way of realizing that is to hire people that look just like you or act just like you or have just your background or have just your whatever, then you could walk away with this incredible warm and fuzzy feeling that you've built this great organization, when in reality you've multiplied your own foibles. Which
to an extent would be kind of attractive to hire people just like you. How's that play in with confirmation bias in metrics?
Well, in confirmation bias, where were you going with that, Todd?
So
you clearly were going.
You measure things that you think you want to see, and because you want to see them, you find metrics that actually confirm what you want to see.
Yeah.
So I'll give you a great example of confirmation bias. It's the one I think of all the time. So you buy this new car, and before you bought this new car, you research and you do all the work, and you find it's the greatest car, and you really want it. And you buy it. You get a good price, right? It's a good deal. You pull off the lot, and suddenly you see tons of the car you just bought. Everyone's driving them around. Before you bought the car, you never saw them. But after you bought the car, you start seeing that red Maserati everywhere. That's kind of confirmation bias.
Huh.
Tell me more.
Huh. So, the example I might reach for rather than Maseratis.
You want another one?
I would do the Lamborghini one. No.
Another one is if you put a fire protection person on an investigation, you will find fire protection problems.
Yeah. If there's a gun hanging over the mantelpiece, someone will die by the end of the second act. Yeah. So I think the online reviews are the best at this, especially expensive things. So someone goes out, hey, I'm going to get a hot tub or something expensive. And then they do this online review. And of course they have to say it was good. First of all, you can't go compare 10 different hot tubs or 20 different hot tubs. So you can't really rank or rate.
Right.
And so you get one, and it was the one you got, and you have to sort of support your own decision. And so the temptation is to say, 5 stars.
Excellent example.
And it doesn't even leak very much, you know?
Excellent. That's a really good example. How does confirmation bias play in our organizational metrics? It's got to play.
Of course it does. Of course it does. You know, because there is an ideal state. We know that there's red, green, yellow. Somewhere there's something good, there's something bad. And so I would say that particularly, I think face validity is probably a good place to look at this. Where does something seem right? Does something feel right? Does something look right? What kind of vibe are you getting from the data?
Yeah.
And I think that is the place where we are more likely to adjust metrics that clash with our internal view of an organization, and more likely to reinforce metrics that support our view of an organization. And if you have an organization that is really very highly reliable, and you're really working towards being high reliable, then you're going to look for metrics that have kind of low standard deviations, right? You're going to be looking for things where everything sort of stays steady Eddie. And if you end up with, massive swings, you're going to start saying, I'm not sure my data is good. I'm not sure I'm measuring what I think I'm measuring. And you may take a second run at it.
So if you had, this is going to be an unfair question, but it's an important question. If you had advice to give to an organization that was really struggling with this metrics question, what would you tell them?
Well, anyone who's struggling with almost anything, I would encourage them to go back to first principles. And I would go and say, what does your organization do? And what is what's your unit of measure? Is your unit of measure $1? Is your unit of measure a widget? Is your unit of measure, a person's development or a community impact? You go back.
Ankle sprain,
man. We could set up a great company. There's enough ice around. The ankle sprain company, the Splintco. And so you got to go back. Excuse me. Got to go. Your surest path is to go back to first principles. What does your company do? Why does it do it? Who cares that you do it? How do you communicate with the people who do care? And so that is probably a very good place to start. A metrics program that has grown and grown and grown and gotten more and more and more robust and more refined is more, from my perspective, more likely to fall into the sort of symbolic or ritualized world.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of why I like this continuous revolution thing.
That's such a cool idea.
Todd, no one has ever asked me how to have a successful marriage, but I'll tell you. Even though you didn't. And so, no, I think the best thing you can do with someone, that's what's called a segue.
No, it's good.
Yeah. I think the best thing you can do with someone else is learn something with them. And I think that's kind of my continuous revolution model, is you don't end up with a great relationship and say, okay, let's change nothing. This is perfect. Just like this. Let's go to bed at the same time every day. Let's eat the same food for dinner every night. That's not how it works. How it works is you say, let's do ballroom dancing. Let's learn archery. Let's go backpacking. And you go off and you start introducing new things, and you start introducing things that you learn and master and discuss and whatever else. Or even, a new movie could do this. And so to end up with metrics that are absolutely, absolutely stable you're not in a developmental spot. And even if you're poring over them and reading them and really thinking about it, I would still argue that you're not priming yourself for any sort of change or evolution. And so I like the notion of shaking them up. And maybe we're back to that Canadian concept of vectoring, where you end up with measuring various things, or you end up shifting your point of view.
Or triangulating. Yeah. I think we might have a perfect marriage today here.
Yeah.
You and I.
Yeah.
We've learned something together.
How about that?
Thanks for a great podcast, man.
You're welcome.
Will you come back?
Of course.
I can't even wait.
Thank you.
That's my buddy Ned. What do you think? We've been friends for years. He was totally not lying. We used to carpool in the olden days. Years and years ago, we'd drive up together to the laboratory, and it was really fun. We'd talk about everything. So that was great. And it was even more fun to get him to talk about metrics and kind of the macro. So if you want to hear more with Ned, just tell me, because it would be an honor to bring him back on and talk more about this. I thought this is a really good podcast. I enjoyed this one immensely. I hope you did too. Sorry for going a little long. I owe you 9 minutes and 19 seconds. Until then, though, get caught doing something good, man. Have as much fun as you possibly can. Learn something new every single day. And for goodness sakes, be safe.